Welcome to episode 22 of Tahrir Podcast. My guest today is Kyle J. Anderson. He's an assistant professor at the State University of New York, SUNY. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's not SUNY. Old Westbury.
That's right, yes. SUNY Old Westbury.
Yeah. His book, which I finished reading not long ago, and which we'll be discussing shortly, is titled The Egyptian Labor Corps, Race, Space, and Place in the First World War. And on that note, I'd also like to thank the Netherlands-Flemish Institute in Cairo for giving me access to their library, where I read the first chapter of the book. Thanks, Tina. Combining sources from archives in 4 countries, Anderson explores Britain's role in Egypt during this period of the First World War, and how the ELC, the Egyptian Labor Corps, came to be, as well as the experiences and hardships these men endured. He also examines the ways they coped through music, theater, drugs, religion, strikes, and mutiny. He illustrates how Egyptian nationalists, seeing their countrymen in a state akin to slavery, began to grasp that they had been racialized as people of color. Excuse the passing by truck. Not only does the book document the history of the ELC, it also works. And its works during the First World War. It also provides an alternative way to which Egypt's 1919 revolution could be interpreted. Welcome.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about the book.
Yeah, glad to have you. So you start the book by talking about Sabbath Hamoud Muhammad. So why don't you start by talking about that guy?
Sure, I mean, Sabbath Hamoud Muhammad is buried in the Oudenkirk Military Cemetery in Belgium. And I started by looking at that particular burial site because it really brought up a number of questions. First and foremost, how is it that this guy, this Falah from rural Egypt ended up in Belgium in the First World War? That's not a story that many people, even many Egyptians, are familiar with. But even more than that, I think it was interesting for me trying to look at Sabbath Hamoud Muhammad's story and how difficult it was to really pin down the details, because if you look at the sources, the grave registration reports for Oudenkirk Military Cemetery, there's a ton of details about the white soldiers and troops from, be it Britain or Russia or Germany or Czechoslovakia. But there's very little information about this one grave, Sabbath Hamoud Muhammad, right? All it says is that he served in the Egyptian Labor Corps. So it shows the imbalance of information and attention that was given to white troops on the one hand and Egyptian laborers on the other. While the white troops have a ton of information in the sources about them, this Egyptian grave only has really a couple lines where it mentions that he served with the Egyptian Labor Corps. So part of what I do in the beginning of the book is I try to trace the possibilities of who Sabbath Hamoud Muhammad could be and how he could have gotten there, which company he might have belonged to, because it's unclear. We don't really know for sure. And I also, I think, make a point about the global color line, right? The existence of a difference in race, the way that people are treated based on their race, right? So the global color line implies a distinction between white people and everybody else, and that white people are privileged systematically through the institution of the global color line. So I think that Sabbath Hamoud Muhammad's story and the imbalance of information in his grave records can really illustrate this global color line. So that's why I start the book with that story.
Yeah. And what is the Egyptian Labor Corps? Like, how can you define that? And how did you first come across it?
Well, I first came across it from my dissertation advisor. When I was getting my PhD, my advisor is Ziad Fahmy, who has written a number of books about the 1919 revolution and Egyptian nationalism after the 1919 revolution. He told me that Egyptians had been recruited to serve in World War I, but nobody really knew many of the details about how many and where they served. And when I got into the British archives for the first time in 2014, that was when I began to discover how large and how long-lasting the Egyptian labor corps was. So the Egyptian labor corps is basically a group of migrant laborers who were recruited from Egypt, mainly from the Egyptian countryside in the Delta and the Said. And they were sent by the British to work behind the front lines, especially in Palestine, as the British were attacking the Ottomans in Palestine and Syria. But they also served in many theaters of battle, including Gallipoli and France. They served in Taranto, Italy. They served in Iraq. They served in Sudan and Libya. And so I was able to, and they served for a long time too. They served actually from 1915 all the way until 1921. So normally when we think about World War I, we think about it ending in 1918. But the Egyptian Labor Corps continued to serve, especially in Palestine, all the way through August of 1921. So when we're talking about the Egyptian Labor Corps, that's what we're talking about. This organization of migrant laborers from Egypt. There were about 500,000 of them total, according to my estimates in the book, who served from 1915 to 1921 on temporary contracts, usually 6 months at a time, in various theaters of battle, supporting the troops. So they weren't carrying weapons or fighting. Sometimes you'll hear, or at least, the Egyptian army used to say, that the Egyptian Labor Corps represented مشاركة الجيش المصري في الحرب العالمية الأولى, right? But it's not the Geish. It's not الجيش المصري. It's this group of laborers who were recruited by the British to support British army troops, and they didn't serve. They didn't, carry weapons themselves. The Egyptian Labor Corps.
Yeah, and how was the process of their recruitment, or their luring them into the ELC? How was that process like?
Well, that's a complicated question and not easy to answer simply because, as I mentioned, there were half a million, 500,000 men who were recruited total, and each one of them went through kind of a somewhat different process. But if we were to think about it in basic schematic terms, you would say about a third of them entered into a contract kind of in a voluntary way, where they were recruited by labor contractors, or later on in the war, it became the responsibility of the Almed in the villages to recruit these young men. But about a third of them entered involuntarily. One of the sources I read said that there were a number of sources mentioned that it could have been an option for men who were going to jail, right? Instead of going to jail, you could serve 6 months in the ELC. And one of the sources I read estimated that about a third of the men entered into the Corps that way, where they would have been arrested for something and they would have been given this option to fulfill their punishment, I guess. And then another third or so would have been forcibly conscripted, right? Tagnid al-Igbari, or something along the lines of a sokhra. And a sokhra refers to this system of forced labor that was common during the Ottoman period, also known in European history as the corvée. And during the First World War, one of the interesting things that I found was that the British actually reinstituted the corvée, or a sokhra. They had claimed to make a sokhra illegal back in the 1890s, but they reinstituted it from 1917 to 1921 or so that they could recruit young men for the Egyptian Labor Corps. So this kind of changes a signature achievement of British policy in the years before the war. So really, it started out with the contractors, and then once the Almed came into the picture in 1917 and got more involved, things got more based on forcible conscription. And finally, in 1918, a sokhra was reintroduced in order to meet this labor requirements.
Yeah, and I don't remember which chapter was it, but there was this passage about how that was kind of compared to slavery at some point. So how and why was that connection made?
Well, the specific examples where we see this being compared to slavery, I found in particular in the writings of Salama Musa. In his memoir, Tarbiyat Salama Musa, he goes to Zakazig, where he grew up, and he talks about the scenes that he saw, and he relates them to Qarya Zanjaya, right? A village of Zanj, right? Or Zanuj. And or Zanug, I guess you might say as well. But the thing that he's talking about at the time is how the men are being transported. What's going on is that they're being tied up with a thick rope around their waist, and they're being tied to men in front of them and behind them with this big thick rope. And then they're being led in a line, being pulled by this rope to get from the villages to the Marquez, the district center, where they would have been kept for a few days or a few weeks before they got transported on in the process. And so Salama Musa looks at this and he compares it to slavery. That's really the most explicit comparison to slavery that I saw. There's a lot of other comparisons that you see to kidnapping, khataf, in the sources of, for example, Saad Zaghloul's memoirs or Ahmed Shafiq Pasha's memoirs. They both talk about khataf, or how the men were, itkhatafu. But I think that there's something deeper kind of underlying these comparisons to slavery, and it has to do with how Egyptians were in a structurally analogous position to Black Africans during the war, right? Because in the years before the war, Egypt always had, and the Ottoman Empire always had, kind of a special status in the British Empire, I should say, because Egypt and in India as well were considered to be Muslim territories, and the British were trying to keep a nominal alliance with the Ottomans. They always treated the Muslim majority in Egypt as if they were unique, right? Like for example, the British Empire in Egypt was ran out of the Foreign Office instead of the Colonial Office or the India Office or the War Office, like other parts of the empire. Egypt was never, before the war, it was never declared a protectorate. It was always technically, legally part of the Ottoman Empire still. And the British just occupied it behind the scenes. And de facto, the British ran the scene, but by law, Egypt was still technically part of the Ottoman Empire up until November of 1914, right? And so what's happening during the war is that special status that Egypt as part of the Ottoman Empire had maintained during the 30 years or so of British occupation from 1882 to 1914, that kind of went away, right? And all of a sudden, Egyptians are no longer legally part of the Ottoman Empire. Now they're legally a protectorate of the British Empire. And they're legally in the same position as a number of other states, including states in East Africa, like the Uganda Protectorate and others. And on top of that, once Egyptians started getting recruited to serve in the Egyptian Labor Corps, they were being treated just like people across the world, including in Africa. The British recruited a number of laborers from countries like South Africa, from the Gold Coast, but also from the West Indies and from India, of course, right? So the special status that Egyptians had and the unique position that they had occupied in the British Empire before 1914 kind of went away during the war. And all of a sudden, Egyptians found themselves in a structurally analogous position to people throughout the British Empire in Africa and India, the British Empire proper, right? You could say that, before 1914, the British operated this kind of veiled protectorate where they were technically running the scenes behind the show, but legally speaking, there was still this veil of Ottoman sovereignty. But during the war, the veil gets kind of ripped off or lifted, and Egyptians become fully integrated into the British Empire. And so when I see metaphors about slavery in the sources, what I interpret from reading those is that Egyptian nationalists are identifying that their special status as sort of part of Islamic civilization connected to the Ottomans has disappeared, and now they are being treated like Black Africans, right? And so we'll talk more about that, I think, throughout the course of this conversation. But since you asked me about slavery, I think it's important to understand that slavery is not just a metaphor for Egyptian nationalists, but that Egyptian nationalists during the 1919 revolution actually grew up in a society where slavery was common, right? Where you had slaves from the Sudan, from Ethiopia, who worked in elite homes as servants. And also you had slaves from Sudan and other places in Nilotic East Africa who were working in fields, in the Azab and in different rural formations in the countryside. So when people like Salama Musa are comparing Egyptians being led away to serve in the First World War to slaves, to me, I think slavery has a particular meaning in his mind, which is associated with Black Africans, with Zanoug in particular. And when he calls this scene Qaria Zangeya, right, he is evoking that connection. In my mind, it's hard to separate that metaphor from the real slavery that Salama Musa and others in his generation actually experienced. And so I think that there are some important racial connotations in what Salama Musa is identifying when he calls scenes in Zakazek like Qaria Zangeya.
Yeah. And generally speaking, what was the nature of the work?
Well, when the men got to the different fields of battle, they were largely engaged in logistical labor, which means moving things from one place to another. So they were transporting supplies and weapons to the soldiers. In France, they were working mainly on the docks, where they would load and unload ships that were full of supplies. They would load them off of ships and put them onto trains, and the trains would go to the front, the Western Front. They did that in Italy as well. When they were in Palestine, they obviously started around the Suez Canal and had to push through Sinai and get to Palestine. And one of the ways that they did that was by building a railroad, which connected Qantara al-Sharq to, I guess it's Qantara al-Sharqiyya, right? Or Qantara al-Sharq on the east bank of the Nile, or on the east bank of the canal, right? And they're moving it, they're building a railroad all the way to Gaza from Qantara. And in addition to building the railroad, they had to build water pipelines so that troops had something to drink out in the deserts of Sinai and into Palestine. So some of the sources call this, a bridge of steel and water that the Egyptian laborers had to build across the desert in Sinai. But they also worked at Port Said and Suez on the docks there. They built roads all throughout Palestine and into Syria. And they were called on to do a number of other odd jobs, like be stretcher bearers or to operate steamrollers to build roads. So they really did basically whatever was necessary. There was a whole separate corps, which was called the Camel Corps, Camel Transport Corps, and they were responsible for moving supplies in the deserts. So before that railroad was finished that connected Qantara to Gaza, all the supplies had to be moved by camel, which were driven by Egyptian young men. And also in Sudan and in Libya, the Western Desert region, camel transport corps were the number one way to transport supplies from one place to another. So basically, Egyptians did everything that was needed to move supplies and ammunition and weapons to the troops.
Yeah. And also when it comes to the 1919 revolution, your book kind of offers maybe radical if viewed by the state, because that's not the most like I recall recently hearing of the Egyptian military celebrating its participation in the First World War, when in fact it was the ELC, the Egyptian Labor Corps. And also when it comes to the 1919 Egyptian Revolution, I was in school not long ago, and I remember I remember studying it, and there was no mention whatsoever of the ELC. And so when I finished reading your book, and kind of got towards the end, it was really like kind of made clear that the ELC kind of played a role specifically in the 1918 kind of revolts, which I also never heard about until I came across your book. So my question is, what does your book add on the literature on the 1919 revolution? Like, how can we understand the 1919 revolution better?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most important contributions that I'm trying to make with this book, is to think about the 1919 revolution differently. I mean, you mentioned how you learned about it in school, and Dina Heshmet has this great book out last year about the 1919 revolution, where she does a close reading of a high school Sanawi al-Amma history textbook, which talks about the 1919 revolution. And the sort of typical way that the 1919 revolution is talked about is kind of Muslims and Christians in the cities getting together to kick out the British after Saad Zaghloul gets arrested and exiled to Malta in March of 1919. And it's usually seen as something that was led by the Afandea and, you know, Muslim and Christian religious leaders and students from the cities primarily together, and then spread out into the rest of the country from that centralized beginning point after March of 1919, right? So that's kind of the standard narrative, I think, that we get, or that, you know, that Sanawi al-Amma teaches about the Egyptian revolution, right? But I think that what happens in that narrative is that this rather small aspect or part of the revolution, which is to say the Wafd and the urban-based Afandea nationalist movement, it comes to kind of stand in or represent the entire revolution, right? It comes to stand in for a number, a variety, a dizzying variety of different activities that were going on throughout the country. So we focus on the Afandea and Saad Zaghloul and the Christian and the Muslim religious leaders, and we ignore all the other things that were going on throughout the country during this moment, right? So Dina Heshmet, in her book that I just mentioned, she has this great line where she says we have to stop thinking about the 1919 revolution as a movement associated with the Wafd and Saad Zaghloul, and instead we have to think about it as a moment, right? Not a movement, but a moment. And the moment means that there's actually this period of time, which I would argue begins in 1918, not in 1919, and stretches all the way through to 1923. And that during this moment, this revolutionary moment, there were a number of different political actions that were going on across the country. And that if we make just one of those movements come to stand in for the whole moment, we do kind of epistemic violence to understanding these variety of different political actions that were going on during this moment, right? And so, as I mentioned, or as you mentioned in your question, right, one of the things that I discovered in the course of writing this book was that there was a wave of riots in response to this recruitment process, this Tagneed al-Igbari, or this Sokhra, the reintroduction of the Sokhra. It led to a number of riots across Egypt in the countryside. I found reports of 35 separate incidents between May and August of 1918 that were preserved in the British archives, but I think that it's probably only a small number of the actual amount of riots that took place that is preserved for us, right? We only have records today that have survived for the last 100 years. So there's probably a lot of records that were disappeared and that we don't have access to anymore, right? But we know that there were at least 35 incidents that took place. And, just for example, 12 of these 35 incidents took place in the single province of Asyut. And, if there were 14 provinces of Egypt at the time, so in a normal distribution, you would have expected a lot less. Asyut has about 4.8 times what you would have expected in a normal distribution of those events, right? So it seems like in Asyut in particular and in Minya, there were a lot of protests in the summer of 1918 before the Wafd even began, right? Before Saad Zaghloul even had the idea to start the Wafd. These protests were happening. And in some cases, they were very large, hundreds of people, whole populations of villages coming out and trying to free people who had been seized by force to go serve in the Egyptian Labor Corps, right? And one of the interesting things that Latifa Salem talks about this, and so does Alia Musalem, how Saad Zaghloul himself witnessed many of these draft riots, right? Because Saad Zaghloul is from Tarbeya, and he would go back to his estates frequently. And in May of 1918, one of his diary entries talks about one of these riots that he saw in response to Egyptian Labor Corps recruitment. So this is in May of 1918. Remember, Saad Zaghloul doesn't even start the Wafd until November of 1918, 6 months later, and he doesn't get arrested and sent to Malta until March of 1919, which is 10 months later, right? So, I think that as the revolution unfolded, what we saw was different types of activities going on in different places. For example, I really focus on Asyut and Minya in my book. And what I think happens in those two provinces is that very quickly things get out of control for the Wafd. So the Wafd does organize a strike and a series of demonstrations, but then there are protests in some cases against the Wafd, in particular Mahmoud Pasha Suleiman, who was a leader of the Wafd who lived in the Said. There's reports of protesters surrounding his house and saying, what has Mahmoud Pasha Suleiman ever done for us, right? And this is one of the leaders of the Wafd who is getting now protested against by these crowds in the 1919 revolution, right? And pretty soon, what happens is you get this proliferation of what are known in the sources as Lagan Wataniya, right? And so in Asyut, you get a Lagna Wataniya, which is largely composed of local lawyers and students who had returned back to Asyut from Cairo and from Alexandria. And they are kind of allied with the Wafd, and they form this organization to try to guide and control the protesters. But there's a number of protesters that are sort of outside their control, right? And the British ultimately are the ones who are able to tamp down and restore order in Asyut and Al-Minya. And the way that they do this is by deploying their army, right? They had just used this army, the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, to conquer Palestine and Syria from the Ottomans. And then they turn around and they let this army loose in Egypt. And in Asyut in particular, the Royal Air Force drops bombs and uses machine guns, excuse me, to get crowds under control. And they send a steamer down the Nile with armor and machine guns, and they use this in addition to the air support to crush basically the rural rebellions in the countryside, especially in Asyut, right? So I think one thing that's important about this is I think basically people in the countryside in places like Asyut and Elminya and in other places, they had gotten so aggrieved by Egyptian labor corps recruitment and by other types of forced conscription of their food and of their animals. Also, there's a lot of pandemic disease going on around this time. This is when the Spanish flu is hitting, right? The last big global pandemic that we had. And so there's a lot of reasons why rural Egyptians in particular are fed up and they're angry with the British. And so we can't necessarily just, reduce it all down to the left and what the nationalists were doing. People were protesting for a lot of different reasons. And even though the nationalists were able and did attempt to try to guide these protests, they struggled in doing so because there were elements that were out of their control. And ultimately, it was the British who were able to restore control. And the Wafd actually negotiated with the British while protests were going on in the countryside and in places like the Suez Canal. So that's one thing that my book adds to the story, is how it gives another reason why people might have protested in the countryside besides just Saad Zaghloul and nationalism, right? But I think that there's another really interesting thing that I found in the course of my research, and that is that a lot of the ELC workers themselves did not participate in the 1919 revolution, right? They continued to be loyal to their British officers all the way up until August of 1921. And there are reports from the officers themselves. Now, granted, these are kind of biased sources, but the officers themselves will say that the Egyptian laborers, the Falahin and the Saada under their command, were actually like rivals with the protesters in the cities when they were in Alexandria and when they were in Cairo, right? They could have, there were, as I mentioned, there were thousands of these men. They could have decided to go join the protests and attack their officers. They did so in other fields of battle. But during the 1919 revolution, these men did not do that. They stayed loyal to their British officers and they continued to serve in the Egyptian Labor Corps all the way up until 1921. And in some cases, they actually filled in for striking laborers who were demonstrating in support of the nationalist cause. In particular, in Port Said, there was a big strike in, I believe it was May of 1919, and all the men who were working on the canal walked out of their jobs to try to paralyze the British logistical network, right? And what the British ended up doing was bringing in men from the ELC, from the Egyptian Labor Corps, to fill in for the strikers. And they were able to continue running people through the canal, even though this strike was going on, because they had this big reserve force of labor, right? So the ELC themselves stayed loyal to the British during the 1919 revolution. And I think that is something that the traditional story of the whole nation uniting into one hand, to show the British the will of the people, right? That story doesn't really fit with the examples that we see in the historical record where people actually stayed loyal to the British during the 1919 revolution. So there's two contributions I think we can make here. One is that there's other reasons besides nationalism why people are protesting in the countryside. Two is that not everybody was actually protesting, and some people were actually staying loyal to the British. And then the last thing I think that the book kind of adds is to think about race and how ideas about race were contributing to mobilizing people during the 1919 revolution. Like in particular, I think we see multiple sources who say that during the war, the British treated us like Black people. They treated us like Black Africans, or they treated us like people of color, is another way that sometimes the sources will put it. And that is wrong. We are not people of color. We are not Black Africans. We are Egyptians. And I think around this time, the notion of a unique Egyptian race starts to take shape, which is connected with the ancient pharaohs. and is considered to be superior to Black Africans and not deserving of subordination to white supremacy because of its long history of civilization in the form of the pharaohs, pharaonic civilization, right? So part of what I see people like Salama Musa or Mohammed Sabri Sorboni or other, I cite this petition as a third source in the book. And what these people are saying is, that the British are treating us like people of color, like any old race, but we're not, we're a proud race. We're an ancient race, not a inferior race. So stop treating us like one, basically. I think that's part of the idea that is animating protests during the 1919 revolution. And the Egyptian Labor Corps plays an important symbolic role in that discourse, because the Egyptian Labor Corps are proof of this kind of enslavement of Egyptians, right? How do we know that Egyptians are being treated like they are inferior, like they are racially inferior? Just look at these men from the Egyptian Labor Corps and the way that they're being treated. And, that should shock you and disgust you. And you should be proud that you're not part of, a race that deserves to be treated like this, but you're part of a race that is proud and ancient and doesn't deserve to be treated like this, basically. That's the kind of idea that I think existed around this time that people don't talk about that much, because it doesn't necessarily fit with a lot of political narratives that circulate around there today.
Definitely. And I highly recommend listeners to grab a copy of your book and check it out. And are you working on any future projects?
Yeah, actually, kind of in the vein of this work, I've become more and more interested in Egypt's African empire that existed, especially during the reign of Ismail, and how he tried to expand Egypt's empire in Massawa and in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia, and in Uganda. So I spent some time with the British Archives this summer, and I'm going to continue, I think, focusing on Egypt's African empire in the 1860s and 1870s for a future book, hopefully.
Sounds promising. Right. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.